Monday, and that so happens to be the day that I like to talk about monsters. I'm Geoff Arbuckle, and this is Monster Mondays presented to you by Film Seizure. You can catch new episodes of Film Seizure with myself and Jason Oliver on Wednesdays, but Mondays, well, they're for me to talk about monster movies. October is a particularly special time for me. I don't so much care about actually going to haunted houses or Halloween parties, nor did I ever really care much for trick-or-treating all that much. All that said, there is something undeniably fun that makes October and Halloween my favorite time of year. There is a massive sense of nostalgia that I get from this month every year. It's a little bit colder, things die as the whole world prepares to go into hibernation for winter, only to return to life in spring. Wind blows a little harder, you need to take jackets with you everywhere you go. It's not so hot anymore that you don't hate the prospect of going on walks. The World Series is on its way as baseball winds down and football gets into the real meat of that sports season. Everything feels crisper, but also spookier, but also more fun and exciting. Much like over at my blog B-Movie Enema, I want to make October slightly more special here on Monster Mondays. You see, back in the late 90s, I was working at a video store. My oldest brother was the manager, and as they were released, he always made sure to get every single one of the classic Universal Monster VHS releases to ensure that they were available to rent for everyone, but that we could also watch them while we worked. Also, roughly around the same time, the Sci-Fi Channel was hitting its stride. One October, they did a different theme for each week of that month. They played Dracula movies one week, werewolf movies the next week, and so on. Later, AMC would basically do the same thing when they used to run horror movies every single day, all day, in the month of October in the 2000s. I got heavily exposed to these classic horror movies that all had this rich kind of gothic black and white feel to them. While I enjoy watching any horror movie during October, there's nothing better than an old black and white movie on a cold, dark night. So that's what I want to do here for Monster Mondays. This month, I'll be talking about black and white horror movies. I will have a couple more interesting movies sandwiched between two of the Universal classic superstar monsters. We begin with what many believe to be one of the greatest sequels of all time, The Bride of Frankenstein. So let's start with the idea of this being a quote-unquote sequel. Keep in mind that while sequels are so common today, it can be argued that sequels weren't quite as popular or even anything that resembles what we think of sequels today. Films were mostly serialized back then, not sequelized. Most of the time, a sequel usually will have some sense of formula. Sometimes they do pick up immediately after the previous film, but outside of musicals and adventure stories in the form of serials, sequels and series weren't quite as common. Musicals would usually just have the year in which the new one came out tacked onto the original title. Serials were mostly shorts cut into an individual episode that would then bring people back each and every weekend for the next part. While the idea wasn't totally foreign, what you'd likely see would be something more along the lines of the James Bond or Sherlock Holmes series, multiple movies using the same lead character, some if not all of the supporting cast, but they were all individually something different from one movie to the next. Regardless, outside of serials that might have had a sci-fi monster type of feel to it, or some horror, it was very unusual to think of horror movies being sequelized. And yet, here we are. There would be two true sequels to the original Frankenstein. While Universal would make many more movies featuring the monster, the first three, Frankenstein, The Bride of Frankenstein, and Son of Frankenstein, are all made in the 30s, all featured Boris Karloff as the monster, and generally considered a trilogy. All three are also pretty highly regarded. And we'll get to Son of Frankenstein someday, but let's talk specifically about The Bride of Frankenstein. Dracula may have been the first and may have been more classically adapted from novel to stage to movie, but Frankenstein was one of the most significant successes in the history of film. It's generally thought of in the same way that great films of the more modern era of Hollywood, like Jaws. The original Frankenstein made about $12 million back when it was released, which would be considered over $200 million in today money. So to call it a phenomenon is kind of selling it short. Not many movies back then made that kind of money, so naturally, Universal wanted to do it again. Universal thought that the only way to make a sequel of Frankenstein would be to bring back director James Whale. Whale didn't exactly agree. He didn't really want to retread the idea, so he more or less avoided it as long as possible. He got to do other movies, one of which was The Invisible Man, which was also really well received, and one of the classic Universal monsters of the era. Long story short, Whale would eventually be wooed back into the director's chair for the sequel when he was given more creative control over the script. And I'll get back to the script here in just a moment. The movie actually starts on a stormy night in a vacation home with friends Lord Byron, Percy, and Mary Shelley, regaling each other with tales of their own greatness. Percy then compliments Mary's Frankenstein tale, and it's generally made clear that from someone so beautiful comes this very ugly and scary tale. She continues her story, and that's where the sequel picks up directly after the original Frankenstein movie. The windmill that was burned down by the villagers makes everyone assume that the monster is dead. However, he survived, as did Dr. Frankenstein. Shortly after being brought home to recover from being thrown off the windmill, he's visited by Dr. Septimus Pretorius, a shamed professor of philosophy and a former mentor of Dr. Frankenstein. He claims the two must work together to perfect his former pupil's original goal. At first, Frankenstein is not so sure, but then can't resist the intriguing things that Pretorius claims to have done. Pretorius has learned how to create life. He has these small little people living in bottles with distinct personalities. Frankenstein thinks Pretorius is kind of nutty, and he is somewhat impressed, but things are kind of terrifying to him. Pretorius says Frankenstein has only gone halfway. If they work together, they can create a woman and a mate for the man Frankenstein created. Meanwhile, Frankenstein's monster is free and wandering the countryside. He begs for help from a girl who owns some sheep on this farm, but she screams in horror and he's run off by men with guns. He eventually finds a kindly old blind man that shares cigars with him and plays music for him. However, when villagers come, the monster is run off again. He eventually runs into Dr. Pretorius, who teaches him more about how to speak more clearly and instills some ideas in him about wanting a mate so that he's not so alone in the world. The monster has a particular dislike for Frankenstein all the way through. This ultimately forces Frankenstein into working with Pretorius to create the Bride of Frankenstein. Sadly, she too is terrified of the monster, and realizing that he could never find love and will always be alone, he basically decides that it's best that they die. He, along with the bride and Pretorius, are inside the castle Frankenstein when it is set to self-destruct. Now let's talk about my three positives for this movie. First up, as I said earlier, I wanted to come back around to the script. This script, and sure, the overall production of the movie is phenomenal and very witty. Yes, there are some more outrageous comedy sprinkled into the movie, particularly from Una O'Connor's Minnie the housekeeper character, but that's not what I really mean by witty. This film was originally intended to be roughly 90 minutes, and about 15 minutes were cut out of it. Some of what was cut was to avoid Elsa Lanchester's cleavage when she wore a 19th century style dress with a low neck. I mean, talk about being really kind of prudish about that. But they also cut out a couple of other scenes altered to basically remove a subplot with Dwight Fry's character killing his family and then blaming the monster. Mostly, though, what was cut and altered were various allusions to a religion and what might have been seen as blasphemous speech about man or science becoming greater than God. That said, Whale was incredibly wily and smart to use the change lines and direct performances to still get the message across that maybe the idea of God the Creator isn't so accurate if man can repeat the process of creating life or unlocking immortality. Additionally, there are definite moments of both hetero and homosexual love and sex at play in this movie. There are certainly moments of the Pretorius character being overly flamboyant and possibly even in love with Frankenstein and luring the good doctor back into the life of mad scientists. It's extremely clever. Second, while Karloff was initially against the monster speaking, he eventually came around to it, and it helps give an even more nuance to the struggle that the monster faces in everyday life. The monster is much more human and less of a villain in this movie. He settles more into an outsider role. He only wants to receive help to make his life easier, and he also really just wants companionship. But he is constantly met with anger, fright, and screams. There was always a measure of misunderstanding for the monster before, but this really shows how he's evolved into being even more human than before. He seeks what we all seek in terms of friendship and understanding. Sadly, people tend to only really see what's on the outside, not the intent of the person's soul or their innocent desires. It's no mistake that the blind man is the only person to really see the monster for what he truly is. No matter how kind Pretorius acts towards the monster, he is really only using him for an ends of scientific discovery. By blowing up Castle Frankenstein, he's not only freeing himself from his own pain, but he prevents the bride from feeling pain from an outside world who would likely never accept her. It's sad, but it's that sense of mercy that proves he's really become human. Thirdly, I really love Elsa Lanchester in this. There is one very important reason why she plays a dual role. In fact, it was a requirement for Whale to do this movie. Whoever was cast as Shelley must also play the bride. It was also to kind of show in a couple of different forms that beauty, and within that physical beauty can also come devious thoughts and horror. Some people don't think of Elsa Lanchester to be very pretty, but I find her actually incredibly beautiful in the part of the bride. Also, in the way that she moves, she is very animalistic and yet very alluring. While it's not entirely her doing, but a combination of her, makeup artist extraordinaire Jack Pierce, and director Whale, her bride became the first iconic female portrayal in horror. And the bride is also one of the earliest iconic portrayals by any female character in pop culture. She's only seen on screen as the bride for just a few minutes, but is massively recognizable to the public as a whole. Any woman with a white flowing dress and hair standing up on its ends, and the first thing many people think of is the Bride of Frankenstein. Stick a white stripe in any long hair, standing up or not, and you just immediately think of the bride. There are very few things that can register so deeply, so quickly with people. Elsa Lanchester will have a place in pop culture history forever, and rightfully so. This movie is a marked improvement in how it's shot, written, and directed from the first film, but there is a little bit of a caveat here. The comedic elements may run thin for some people, particularly in the first half of this film. The second half takes a much more serious angle, with Minnie's role in particular being greatly reduced. But beyond the overall quality being improved, mileage may vary on how much newer views the viewers will take to it. Either way, this movie will always have an audience and will always be considered one of the finest horror movies ever made. That wraps up this week's Monster Mondays. Until next week, I'll see you later, and don't forget to check out new episodes of Film Seizure every Wednesday and a new installment of Monster Mondays each Monday on FilmSeizure.com, as well as check out new posts at my website, bmovieanima.com, each and every Friday morning.